Hi everybody, I am George Grant, the YouTube psychodynamicist, and I'd like to discuss tonight about group therapy. I run a group twice a week at the Jersey Battered Women's Service for the perpetrators of domestic violence. How not to run a group? Well, it's a group, right? And it differs somewhat from individual treatment. The group is a group, and running a group as if the members are an individual treatment but in parallel process ignores the group's very nature. How do you run a group? Well, we have to look at how the group helps. Groups elicit the mechanics of the family and can elicit self-destructive behavior, right? So they can elicit quite often the sorts of behavior that the person would like to address in treatment. Groups allow members to see how others respond to them with many emotional interactions in a short period of time. So quite often it becomes sort of a therapy shortcut. We get a lot of input, a lot of interactions. And also quite often the other group members, the siblings in this sort of a model, a therapeutic model of the family, the siblings can be a lot more direct than the parents or the group facilitators can. Groups afford members many diverse views of their behaviors, and group treatment affords members instantaneous feedback and is more an in vivo therapy as opposed to individual therapy, which is more in vitro. So the therapist normally in individual treatment doesn't typically shoot from the hip. I mean, occasionally, but we do so in a way that's maybe a little more informed, a little more cautious. Other group members, not so much, right? So that can be both good and bad. It could be, on occasion, a little overstimulating, but it does tend to be a little faster and somewhat different. The group becomes the member's emotional laboratory. Okay, so they can get reactions, try things out there, even ask other group members what they think. Right, so it's a great place to bring a problem and ask. Group can be the easy on-ramp to therapy in terms of both cost and commitment, right? So there's a lot more transferences, there's a lot more interactions, but those transferences are much more dilute than you would get in one-on-one therapy. Also, the cost is less. Rather than getting an analytic hour, somewhere between 40 and 50 minutes of the therapist's time, it's spread out over many individuals and typically costs less. So bridging is one of the key techniques in group treatment, and what it does is it brings the group together and it gets the group members interacting with each other. It can be exhausting to be running a group and having everyone interact in parallel with you. It's a lot of work, and you're kind of defeating part of the advantage of a group, and that is namely to have the other members of the group be co-therapist with the group facilitator, right? So run the group like it's a group. Bridging. An open-ended question could be a form of a bridge. So if you direct this at the group, say an object-oriented question, which is just sort of a general question, not particularly directed at anyone and outside the relationship, something along the lines of, should somebody be saying something? I don't know, should they? Right? Give the group a choice. What article should we read next? Should we read an article next? What is it that we should do next? You could direct open-ended questions at individuals. Jane, what could Emily's foot be saying by tapping? Fred, I wonder if Judy, who's texting, received any calls for you. Okay, directed questions. Questions that sound like an interpretation. Bob, I guess you're aware that Rachel feels injured by what you just said. Or questioning a group member about other subgrouping members. Gwen, what feeling is Judy hiding from Carlos right now? Or Bob, do you think Phil is asleep? That kind of question is possibly a Zoom question. Okay. When to bridge and when not to bridge. Was that a Shakespearean tragedy? Maybe a comedy. Take special care with timid members. Some people have sort of an abandoning sort of attachment where they can tolerate if you're there a little bit, but not too much. So don't come on too strong with very timid members. Do not introduce a third person to two others. In other words, don't use a third person to bridge with two others subgrouping, that we just mentioned, who've just discovered each other and are communicating progressively. Okay, because it could also be that even though they're kind of acting in a little bit, they're also modeling how to communicate progressively with each other. Okay, so you're always trying to do maybe a little bit less as the group facilitator. Do not introduce a bridge as a defensive tactic. Okay, if you're feeling attacked, don't start bridging. Right? You could introduce what you're feeling, but it's probably a good idea to not be defensive in general. What would be the objection to feeling defensive? If a directed question fails, inquire how the object of the question really feels. In other words, you say something, maybe you make an interpretation, and the person says, "Oh, no, not at all." Oh, well, could the feeling be shared with us? What was the feeling that happened instead? And rely much more on open-ended questions than on directed questions. Be careful with directed questions. Anything involving the letters U or Y. What questions are preferable to Y questions, and the word you, as in why did you do that? I use both there. Can oftentimes sound very pointed, and to some people, like for example timid members, they might sound very attacking. So take special care with those kind of interventions. Transference. That's not something when you have a bus ticket and you want to get on another bus. No. So transference is the total thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and reactions brought from the client's past to the present. This transference may not always promote the most adaptive way to resolve a situation in the client's life or in the group. However, it's important to say that it did in the client's past, and that's why it's there. Right? The past is present. Countertransference, the analyst's transference. Okay, so that's my version of the transference when I'm with a group or with another person. Now, countertransference, it makes it sound like it's in reaction to the transference, but but they may arise simultaneously, right? It's like Newton's third law: for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Action, reaction. It sounds like the action happens first, then the reaction occurs. Well, they could both arise together, right? Is probably a better way to think about that. So objective countertransference, a reaction to the client's or the group's transference. Okay, so this is more the case of anybody would have a similar countertransference under similar circumstances. If you're out of the person's presence and that countertransference goes away, it's likely objective. A subjective countertransference, a reaction to the client originating in the analyst. They remind you of a person or situation from your past, or they do something that you just find very grating or annoying, or just reminds you of something that's just awful. And one of the things about the subjective countertransference is when they leave, it stays with you, and you sort of think about it, right? It kind of stays with you. Countertransference resistance, when the analyst defends against the feelings that the client evokes. So if for whatever reason you're feeling a certain way about a client and you can't really admit that to yourself, that is a countertransference resistance. Sometimes it takes a long time to figure out what this is. Always a good idea to be in supervision, even if it's pure supervision, just to get insights into things like countertransference resistance. So what the therapist feels. You're in the group and you have a fantasy about, I don't know, you're going to eat dinner later, and you have a fantasy about a hamburger. So what does this early stage fixation have to do with the group? Are they all thinking about going out to the parking lot and having a cigarette? Or is it something else? Are they just feeling very regressed this evening? You find yourself being impulsive. The rule is 10 minutes late and no more, or else the group doesn't count, right? Impulsively, somebody's 11 minutes late and you, I'll mark them here, I'll be nice today. So, why did you do that? Why did you act impulsively? Parapraxis, slip of the tongue. What is it? I think Biden said we have something about the greatest voter fraud network or something. Really? Ooh. Well, thanks for telling me. Yeah, that's a parapraxis, and sometimes I don't know if everybody remembers Norm Crosby. He used to be on all those Dean Martin roasts in the 70s. Of course, I'm dating myself, which is legal in some southern states. So he always used to say things like, I'm sorry I got all misconstrued. Spoonerisms, malapropisms, and parapraxes. Of course, we like to look into that symbolically and see what the person might have really wanted to say. Moments of amnesia. You're going to do something or say something to the group and you forget, or somebody explains something to you, maybe you're having supervision and you forget that. Okay? So it hasn't quite gotten to the conscious mind yet. It's still hiding there someplace in the unconscious. Seeing ourselves in motion. I really shouldn't be doing this, but I'm going to let this slide. Sometimes people are doing something during a Zoom meeting, especially during the groups on Zoom, and you kind of let it go because, oh God, if I did this with everybody or whatever our rationalization is, and we sort of see ourselves in motion. I really shouldn't be doing that, but so what's that about? Habits of body posture. Do you stand up very straight normally, but today you're slouching? What's that about? You cross your leg in a certain way. Today you're crossing it differently. What's that about? You do something like this. What's that about? Right? So what does that mean? What does that mean in other people too? Congealing, right? It's same old complaint fests with the same old topic. We're saying the same old stuff. Nothing new. Nothing too overstimulating. Nothing particularly, it's not that people aren't taking part, but it's the same old stuff, right? No new ground covered. Complaints from the group. These could be transferential, right? In their transference, you're somebody out of their past. Could be a manipulation. I got here 3 minutes early, so you should let me go 3 minutes early. Or it could be valid, right? They could be picking up on maybe a countertransference resistance, and if you listen carefully, maybe they'll tell you about it. Okay. Group defaults. So what typically in a group gets said, and what typically is not being said, right? What's conspicuous by omission? I think every group has group defaults, right? So what's being said, what's not being said. Okay, what the therapist observes in the group. How do members express new feelings toward one another? Okay, is somebody just kind of noticing somebody else, or is somebody making, some kind of insight about the other person, or sharing their thoughts, right? Is it sort of an initial bridge between two people? So how do they express those feelings? How do they go about it? How do the emotional relationships evolve? Are there people in the group who've grown very close? Are there people who don't really seem to see each other at all? Are there people in the group who just can't stand each other? I mean, everything short of open gunplay in the group happens. They, and they know that they just don't like each other. So how do the relationships evolve, and why? So to move this progressive emotional communication along, group facilitators should ask group members about each other, knowing that they are talking about themselves in the process. Just the other week in group, I had a very interesting example. I happen to know that one of the group members is the son, his mother was he had told me this in a previous session. His mother is a high school, or I think he said high school, or a school principal. And he began to complain something to do with kids today. Now he did not go to college, and he was complaining that people put too much pressure on kids to achieve academically. So he wasn't really talking in a general case, and that's kind of the subtlety of the group, is that as the group members are talking about each other, they're really talking about themselves, right? And here it kind of leapt into neon as I could, as I understood that he was really talking about his perception of how his mother felt about him, right? Maybe she doesn't actually feel that way, but that was his perception, and he was disclosing that in the group. Okay, doppelgangers. Your evil twin, or your somebody who is like you, but in the group and in this context, somebody who maybe has a similar transference resistance sort of complex. So instead of asking people about themselves, we should ask them about others, knowing that they're also talking about themselves. So it would be good if you could ask one person about another with a similar behavior or a similar constellation of behaviors, right? It would be very helpful, and it might even be as if the person's looking in the mirror. Maybe each would be looking in the mirror as they see each other. So an example, that's your pattern too, Felice, isn't it? Don't you also avoid men who seem wishy-washy? Ask Felice to obliquely explore another member's similar feelings. What do you make of George's silence concerning his troubles with his wife? So, similarity between underlying feelings. And Henry, do you know anyone like that? So, you're asking them to maybe reconstruct something, right? Maybe some sort of situation was just mentioned. I could have used that as an intervention when the person in my group was saying that parents put too much academic pressure on kids today, when I suspected he was really talking about himself. I could bring that right to the surface if I don't feel it's too overstimulating. Does Peter's treatment remind you of anyone else's in the past? Right, so maybe Peter was treating someone a certain way, or maybe Peter was being treated in a certain way, right? So did this ever happen in the past? Is this what we would call a repetition compulsion, right? Oftentimes we try to repeat that complex of transference and resistance in the hopes of working through. We call this complex the repetition compulsion, but because the underlying transferences and resistances don't really change, the attempt to work through becomes a repetition, right? And we serially repeat this process that feels safe. Even though to outsiders it may not look safe, it may not be safe, but it feels safe because we know what to do when it occurs. And we're hoping to work through it, but since the underlying process doesn't change, it actually, we don't work through it, we just repeat it. Okay, confrontation. To be used sparingly. It should be simple, direct, should be a statement, and avoid speculation. Okay, so straight ahead with this, right? If you're going to confront somebody, do it very, very directly. Notice that no matter what John says, no one responds to him. Okay, so that's not equivocal, right? Making a statement of what I think, feel, and perceive, what I see occurring. Okay. Don't be a fixer. Don't fix anything. Please. Let's see. The member to become aware that he's repeating some activity that miscarries, depriving him of certain fruits of life, or that it is exerting an undesirable impact on at least some other people. That's the first goal. The second goal, the member clearly recognize what he's doing and experience himself doing it in the moment, right? Starts to become conscious, right? This repetitive act. The member discover why he's ultimately doing what he's doing. We may not know the history of it, although we probably have a pretty good suspicion. We'll probably know the feeling not had in the moment, though, right? We'll probably know what this repeated behavior, what feeling that's defending against. Okay, and oftentimes, if you ask the person, does that remind you of anything that happened in the past? Quite often, it's sort of familiar. Yeah, that reminds me of whenever. And that the member achieved mastery over it. In other words, they can talk about it in an emotional, progressive way and gradually talk about it in the group without really holding back at all. Right? They're completely free to talk about what used to be unconscious and what used to hold sway over them. This is a great quote by Jung. It says, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Okay, psychoanalysis is not a religion, right? It's the process of making the unconscious conscious, right? Because quite often we try not to have certain feelings. The feelings, no matter how unpleasant, our feelings, usually pass fairly quickly, except the ones that we don't allow ourselves to have. Those persist, and those can make for great difficulty in our lives. So we're not out to get rid of the darkness. We just want to make it conscious. So the geography of resistance. Okay, so this is the other half of things. We talked about transference at great length. The geography of resistance, what is it? What does it look like? A resistance is the forces that curb attachment to the group, that interfere with sharing experiences, and that undermine solidification and consolidation. It keeps you from sharing everything with the group. It keeps you from saying everything in the group. Okay? Individual resistance, one member shows up late habitually. That would be an example, right? So you could lend them your ego. How do I get you to be late every time? I know it must be something I'm doing. Right? So you loan them your ego. A subset resistance, a faction of the group shows up late or steps out of the room during group. Okay. Bunch of people all leave, go to the men's room. Hey guys, group's only an hour and a half. What happened? Or you could do something similar. Wow, I make everybody want to go to the bathroom. How do I do that? And a group resistance, a substantial number of people in the group show up late. Okay, I can remember during a class at ACAP, everyone showed up late, and the result was that we talked about what we could do to get there on time, and even those resistances that seemed external and were completely beyond themselves because we talked about them we were able to figure it out. We resolved our resistances to getting to class on time, even though a lot of the resistances of the people in the room seem to be external. Okay, unveiling resistances. Oops. One method is to find a pair of members, one of whom has the resistance and the other who has in some respect been victimized by the resistance and is sensitive to it. I'm thinking of two people in my ice drive group on Saturday. One who makes stimming noises almost purposefully, and the other one who does everything possible to control his stimming noises. Another method, so you might ask the one who tries to control the stimming sounds, what do you think that sound means when so-and-so makes it, right? Another method for surfacing a member's resistance is to have it described by someone who engages in the same resistance or who used to engage in it and no longer does. Okay, so very similar idea. A third method would be to ask the group what they think is missing in an individual. What do you think would help Fred to arrive on time? Does anybody have any ideas? Maybe any insights, or maybe helpful things that they do that enable them to get here on time? Recreate the situation that evokes the resistance to make the resistance easier to identify. Usually not necessary. It's in modern analysis, this is usually like when the student asks, do I have to make an effort to be frustrating? Well, usually the process is frustrating enough. There won't have to be any overt frustration introduced. So the resistance usually creates itself. Resolving resistance. Prognostication. What might happen if the behavior continues? Something good, something bad, something being avoided. Should I be worried? Should the group be worried that something bad might happen if the behavior continues? The secret desire. What is the advantage or the objection to either doing something that's contrary to the resistance or not engaging in whatever the resistive behavior is? Is there a secondary gain? What happens as a result of the behavior? Do people give the person who has this terrible situation a lot of empathy in the room, a lot of attention, right? Or even negative attention. We've all seen this happen with children. We've seen them, be completely obnoxious, but they get attention, and when they get the negative attention, there's usually a little smile, even though they just got yelled at. So sometimes there's a secondary gain involved. What would happen if the behavior did not happen? There'd be no attention. So an ego-syntonic mirroring and joining, hopefully from other members, joining the feeling, not the action. I hate banks. I should rob a bank. Let's go out and rob a bank. That's joining the action. Don't do that. Join the feeling. I find banks very frustrating. I find them very dishonest. Joining the feeling. That's terrible. More regressed. I feel terrible when that happens too. A little less regressed. Okay, in the first case, that's a pretty regressed narcissistic transference. You're actually a part of the other's mind, right? That's terrible. I feel terrible when that happens too. Here you're kind of twinning. And, these two interventions work 80% of the time with 80% of resistances. The creative part is what do you do with the other 20%, both time and the resistances. Those can be the really creative interventions and where you can make the most difference. So what are some of the indicators of transference, to bounce back to transference again? Pervasiveness of the reaction. When the person does this, you always feel like that, or when they tell you a story about an interaction with an individual, their action in the story is always pretty consistent, right? Insistence of the reaction. No, that's really the way it is. Or it always happens, or a lot of absolutes. Okay, so they're very sure about this is the way things are, even if you ask, well, has it ever not been like that? Are there any exceptions? Excessiveness of the reaction. Somebody gets just triggered and goes over the edge, even more so than is typical of your average millennial. Just over the edge, up the other side, down the street and around the block. They just come unhinged. Displacement onto others. Well, they made me do it. Oh. How did they do that? Solvents of transference. What is the behavior? What developmental purpose does the behavior serve? Why would it be good, for example, for a 2 or 3-year-old to keep yelling no, right? Well, they're trying to separate, right? And figure out where the boundary is between them and mom. So that's sort of trying to figure out where that boundary is. And what does the client wish to accomplish with the behavior? Could there be a lot of different ways to accomplish the same thing? Any particular reason why that behavior as opposed to another? What actually happens with the behavior? So there's an idea of what they think will happen, but what actually does happen, right? These might be two different things, right? So they may consciously be aiming for one goal, but unconsciously they're really doing something else. So a lot of times the way in which the behavior misses the stated mark can be very helpful. Who should receive the bridge? Quite often it's very helpful if another group member intervenes in these ways. People have a flair for reconstructing other people's pasts, right? Usually it's easier with other people because it's hard to see you, but it's easier to see others, right? So it's more objective to observe somebody else. You're obviously not as invested in their behavior. People with similar pasts and childhoods, similar developments. someone who's especially sensitive to the behavior, maybe someone who just recently became aware of that behavior and is trying to not do it as much. Consolidating the new. Okay, so when there's been a change made, we want to consolidate that and make them immune, maybe not necessarily to regressing, because we can all have a bad day, a bad time, and we regress. But we developmentally, we want to get them further along, right? So maybe they can regress back to that, but they're still capable of doing more advanced things, responding to things in more advanced ways. We could model the new trait. We could observe in them even rudiments of the new traits, right? Oh, Fred, thank you for getting here within the 10-minute time limit. We really appreciate, your punctuality. Thank you for doing that. Use regressions creatively. It really depends on the regression and knowing the person here. This is one of those interventions that's not 80% of the people 80% of the time. So it really sort of depends on the situation. Help members see their line of progress. Wow, that's a big change, Bob, from when you first came here, right? So now you're using your I statements, you're taking time outs, where before you might have gotten angry and done something that maybe you didn't want to do. Immunizing the person against the regression. You might say a little something in a way that harkens back to the regression, so that it's like a little jab, a little what Spotnet's called the toxoid response. You give them a little dosage of what might have caused the regression in the first place, and and let them finally talk through that as something that's conscious and observe that they don't react to it in the same way. Okay, so immunizing the member against regression, that's the same as Spotnet's using the toxoid response. Okay, finally, I would recommend anything by Louis Ormont, anything by Leslie Rosenthal, and Spotnet's The Couch and the Circle. All great reads on how to run a group. Okay, I hope that helps. If anybody has any questions, you can post them below. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Okay.